Coogs house. All right, we're back into game week with the football program. It's time to go get a win. It's time to get on a winning streak. Let's get to it.
You are Locked On Coogs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Cougs, daily podcast all about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach Parker Ainsworth. And whether you're a Houston fan or just a hater that can step by, thank you for making Locked On Cougs your first listen of the day. Appreciate you making your first listen each and every day. If you're enjoying the conversation but don't know what to say, tell us in the comments down below. Well, what's the gamiest meat you've ever eaten? Are you an alligator fan? What's the gamiest thing you're going for these days? Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And we got more on that fun later, but we want to talk about Houston and getting ready for Kansas this week. I want to talk about what it means to come to this game off of a bye week. I think that's an important factor of this. I want to talk about what Kansas does and doesn't do well, but I also want to just talk about what to make of this Kansas Jayhawk football team as Houston gets ready to play them on Saturday. Because honestly, it's one of Houston's weirder opponents to get ready for. Not sure what to make of them in a lot of ways. For those that have been following me, and I do power rankings and stuff like that in the Big 12 for College Sports Wire, and I've been down on Kansas all year. I think my running tagline in that is that it's hard for Kansas to be ranked anything but last in an FBS conference when they have no FBS wins. And it kind of feels like they're a long way away from that. Now, I watched a couple of Kansas games. I talked to my buddy at Locked On Jayhawks, hoping to have him on. Derek Johnson's great host, hoping to have him on later this week as a guest. And so I feel like at this point in the season, we've got 6 games to look at. I think I know a lot about the Kansas Jayhawks, but they're a weird team. They were 9-4 last year, and I guess you want to go back further. In Lance Leipold's first year, they went 2-10. They were Kansas. That's kind of what Kansas did for a long time, with the exception of a brief stint there, right? Then they go 6-6, make the Liberty Bowl and lose in Liberty Bowl in a barn burner to Arkansas. It's Jalen Daniels, this Lance Leipold guy's got some maybe knows what he's doing. Last year they go 9-4. It's Kansas is good all of a sudden. What's this Leipold guy? And Lance Leipold's also considered the next hot coach for a lot of Midwest jobs. He's a Midwest guy. For those of you that follow small school football, he was a D3 coaching legend that has moved his way up. And frankly, a lot like Houston and Willie Fritz, kind of has a similar trajectory, but his peaks were higher, or peaks were longer, I should say, lasted longer than Willie Fritz's great time at Sam Houston State. But then he had a few other stops that were shorter, where Willie stayed each spot kind of more consistent amount of times. Leipold is considered a big, is going to get a Big Ten job. Is Kansas just a stepping stone for this guy, etc. He's a little bit younger too than Fritz. And he was a big coaching name in those circles. And this year, after going 9-4 last year, like I said, they're 1-5. Their lone win is over FCS's Lindenwood. And Lindenwood, I did some Googling, is 3-4 themselves. They're not a stellar FCS team or anything. They lost, a handful of blowout kind of FCS games. Lindenwood was not good. For more on Kansas, they've, as Houston gets ready to play them, it's easy to look at they've lost to an unranked Illinois team by a touchdown. I guess Illinois is now 22nd in the country and 5-1, but at the time that looked really bad. Kansas lost to UNLV. Well, Houston knows UNLV pretty well. Kansas lost them by 3 whole points earlier this year. UNLV was good. Sluka was still there. That's a closer game than Houston played with UNLV. So what do we think about that, right? Then Kansas went and lost in Morgantown to West Virginia. Well, I don't know how much you follow West Virginia this year. West Virginia's kind of had a roller coaster, but they have trouble beating good teams. So what does it say about the fact that they beat Kansas, right? We're back into this kind of dichotomy. Just a couple weeks ago, Kansas lost to TCU. by 11 points. Yes, that TCU, the same one Houston just beat by 11 points. Transitive property does not always work in college football, but I think it's easy to think about, like, okay, well, if Houston just beat TCU by double digits and TCU just beat Kansas by double digits, if so facto, this shouldn't be close. But then Kansas lost to Arizona State by 4. And what weirdly is their best loss? Arizona State looks good, question mark. And so Houston, as they get ready for this, like, can't fall into this trap where they look at Kansas as a bad team just because of their record. Now, I don't think Kansas is going to win a lot of games this year. I'm looking at 2 or 3 wins max, but you darn sure, if you're Houston, don't want to be one of those 2 or 3 wins, right? That's just not something you can afford to have happen right now. I would stress that of those games, I believe it's 4 of their 5 losses are by a touchdown or less. They were in those games, and several of them they had leads late. Also impressive and important. And so Kansas, I think, is like weirdly a trap game for Houston. Houston comes off of a big win over TCU. They think they found their starting quarterback. Things are feeling good. You get pat on the back on campus for a couple weeks. The basketball programs, obviously preseason top everything. And so, the school's kind of got a good aura around the athletic department. And now you're marching up to Arrowhead to play these games. I would stress that you're also looking at, like, in a weird way, this Arrowhead thing kind of playing its toll on this. So if you haven't been listening, haven't been paying attention, or just don't know, Kansas is not playing traditional home games this year. Kansas is in Lawrence, Kansas. They're playing their home football games in Kansas City, about an hour and a half away, because they're renovating the stadium and they can't house people there for games. Well, what that means is that as Kansas has continued to do worse, they're having less and less people show up to the games, right? It's kind of stark, to say the least. And I look at this, I'm like, okay, well, Houston's going to get to go play in this, what feels kind of more like a neutral site game in Arrowhead Stadium. That's a cool experience, playing in a pro stadium, etc., right? But Kansas, while it's not their home stadium, is now kind of getting more used to this whole idea of playing in a pro stadium, playing an hour and a half away. Fans have figured out the tailgate situations and whatever, right? Like, things are working out a little bit better. And so I worry that there's a lulling to sleep here, because Kansas bluntly is bad. They are. But they're not, I don't think, as bad as a 1-5 record says. And I just don't want to get too big for our britches yet. I think there's a real chance here that, honestly, Houston overlooks this in the wrong way. And I know it's weird to think about. I don't think Fritz is the kind of guy that would have his program doing that at all. Fritz is from Kansas. It sounds like he's going to have a bunch of people there himself, and he don't want to get embarrassed in front of those people, right? Actually, he might be from Missouri, Kansas City area. So I actually don't know what side of the city he'd be from, and that determines what side of the state he'd be on, or which state or whatever. But the area, right? The area. Now, I do think on the whole, there are some things that Kansas does and doesn't do well. And so I want to talk some about those in a second. But before we get to that, I want to talk to you about a partnership we got with our buddies at Roy. Return on You, because it's time to recognize the Roy Player of the Week. Yes, on a bye week, we're still giving out a Roy Player of the Week. This year so far, we pulled over $10,000 to support players on Roy. Micro deposits can lead to a massive change with the Roy app. You can direct your support to athletes you love, ensuring that all funds go to specific players that you choose. Unlike collectives, you can know exactly where your money and support is going, and you even get to receive exclusive content like personal videos and updates and all kinds of things like that after the season's over. The best part is it's all risk-free. If the athlete transfers or doesn't deliver on the content, you get your money back. And this week, even though it was a bye week, our Player of the Week went to AJ Halsey. as the defensive player of the week from the week prior. So we pitched in $100. I'd love for you to join me. Even $10 would make the difference. Go show Halsey the love and keep him connected to the school and program. Remember, pay today, celebrate tomorrow. Your support can help set up the team for success. Plus, don't miss out on Roy's exciting giveaway. I give away 2 tickets to a game in November. Just download Roy, create an account, enter referral code LOCKED on. And just like that, you're entered. Already on Roy, any contribution to Athletes campaign also gets you entered automatically. No purchase necessary, void where prohibited. Download Roy now. Join the NIL gang with no subscriptions and no fees. And be sure to check us out on Instagram, Facebook, X, at Roy_return on you for more info. Roy, support the players, change the game. Parker Andrew, Locked On Coogs. You're talking about Houston's upcoming opponent, the Kansas Jayhawks. And I told you, I looked at this up and down. I think Houston is, danger of getting trap gamed here. Kansas might not be as bad as people think. And I went and looked at, what does Kansas do well? What does Kansas not do well? More breakdowns throughout the week. Again, we're trying to get Derek Johnson on later this week. We do our typical crossover show to hear a little bit more about it from the horse's mouth. But I think it's interesting on a couple fronts. One, you think of a 1-5 team, the most common critique is like, well, they can't block anybody. They got this Jalen Daniels guy quarterback, but they can't block a soul and whatever, right? And with Kansas, that's not the case. They actually block really well on film. I would argue, like in a qualitative sense, they got some road grader, beefy guys that really do a good job in the run game up front. If you look at their PFF grades, which are not perfect, but Pro Football Focus does an analytical look at like how often you're doing the right thing in the right place at the right time and so on. 4 of their top 6 grades are 4 of their 5 offensive linemen. They're really pretty strong up front, which is counterintuitive, you think of, to a 1-5 football team, right? You think of like a 1-5 football team, the offensive line is half the offense. Just the odds are that they're not going to be that good up front. That's not the case. Jalen Daniels, the quarterback, and starts at a quarterback. He's having about 3 seconds to throw per attempt, and the average depth of targets over 12 yards. Those are both indicative of having plenty of time to throw the football. You could argue about like scheme and whether or not he needs the depth of target or whatever, but on the whole, that's strong. Those are both strong averages for their offensive line. They reflect well in the offensive line. They're, for what it's worth, on the run game side of things, top 15 in run blocking yards added by the offensive line, meaning that of their rushing yards, Pro Football Focus goes through and tries to quantify how much of this is on good run blocking, how much of this is on good running back play, and they're top 15 in the country in it being on good run blocking. And don't need to tell you that being top 15 in the country in anything is really impressive, right? It's just interesting that it's coming from a team that is, again, 1-5. Just not a thing that we see connected a whole heck of a lot. They do run a lot of option, a variety of different formations and motions, and they'll window dress it and do a bunch of different things to Houston and really try and confuse Houston, especially coming out of a bye week. They'll have, a bunch of things that Houston hasn't seen before. They're coming out of their own bye week, and so Houston's going to have some stuff they haven't seen on tape because they got extra time to practice it. But they run triple, they run speed, they run midline, they run a lot of different option quarterback read kind of stuff. Jalen Daniels is an elusive athlete. He's a pretty strong athlete. Yes, he's the same guy that we remember from a couple years ago when Houston played them and was technically a non-conference game when Houston was the American back then. And so you look at this offense. Okay, well, what's the problem? Well, they're having trouble staying in games late. They are turning the ball over some. Again, 4 losses by a touchdown or less. They've had leads in the fourth quarter of a bunch of these games. I think their real weakness and the reason that they have some trouble here is the back half of their defense. Their coverage unit struggles, to say the least, right? And Mello Dotson's probably their best corner guy, and I'd call him good. I don't know that I would say that about a lot of other guys they haven't coverage yet, though, right? And I would imagine that if you look at what they do to try and cover that up, they're sagging guys off, backing guys up, playing in front, making complete the ball in front of them so they can rally and tackle. They miss a handful of tackles too, right? This is the kind of game, though, I think that because of that, you could potentially see like a lot of Stacey Sneed catches out of the backfield, a lot of Rashawn Sanford's catches out of the backfield. Those kind of routes tend to be open against Kansas. More on schematics of that throughout the week, but I think that that's kind of what you could see Houston really exploit here. Even Jaden York, Malik Carr, those tight end kind of areas of the field at the same kind of spots. It looks like Mekhi Muse is going to start this week in the slot. I wonder if he can get some bubbles and arrows and quick stuff as well. Even just a simple now concept, get in the ball in space and let him see if he can make a guy miss. I think that that's going to be where Houston excels. Now, that's what I thought in watching them a couple times. I talked again to Derek over Locked On Jayhawks. And you'll hear from this week, I believe, but he thinks the issue is the pass rush. He thinks guys get really comfortable and thus can kind of pick stuff apart. That's why he thinks their coverage guys have to back up so much, is because they know that they're going to have to cover for a long time. So might as well go ahead and get into the back pedal early. Which I don't know if that's what I would diagnose it as. I do think it's interesting in looking at their defensive stats. They don't have a whole lot of sacks. Jerome Robinson's got 3.5 on the season, but only 2 other guys have multiple on their defensive front. So it's not like they have a bunch of pressure. I think that Jerome Robbins guy's pretty good, though. And so I don't know that I would say they have trouble in pass rush, but Derek watches them as close as I do Houston, and that's what he thinks they at, right? Defense is definitely the worst side of the ball, though. Regardless of where you want to poke the hole in it, defense is definitely the worst side of the ball. And it looks like, to me, part of the reason they have these leads in the fourth and can't seem to win games is that the defense wears out by the fourth quarter. You're seeing more missed tackles. You're seeing more silly or dumb decisions, right? Where it's like that was a tired decision made by a football player. And I think if that's the case, right, then what you are going to see is Houston maybe in a competitive game throughout, and then some exciting Zeon Chriss elusiveness down the stretch. Or you'll see, Rashawn Sanford make a couple guys miss and then off the races, right? Or those kinds of things in the fourth quarter, I think, are what a predictive measure would be on this game, right? That seems to be how a lot of Kansas games go. And it seems to be kind of thing that, frankly, if Houston can stay the course and stay focused throughout the full 60 minutes of football, they got a real shot at those kinds of things in this as well. It's nice for a team in Houston trying to find their offense still in the season. The defense is the weak point of Kansas, right? We saw when Houston played Oklahoma, it was the opposite. The offensive side of Oklahoma's team was struggling, but the defense was good, right? And stuff like that. Iowa State, right? The offense struggled for about 3 quarters, and but Iowa State's defense is really good, right? It's nice to finally get an opponent that's the inverse of that. But on the whole, I would say that this would be an interesting game because of where the holes on the 2 different teams are. Now, Houston had a bye week, and they're coming off of a bye week, and I think it's actually really well timed for this game specifically. Before we get to that, I told you today's show is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And as America's #1 sportsbook, you can get big return on FanDuel this NFL season. When you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You can start with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. You can place your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Parker Ainsworth, Locked On Coogs here, breaking down Houston and Kansas this upcoming weekend. We talked a lot about Kansas as an opponent throughout the show today. And now I want to talk a little bit about Houston, as Houston comes off of a bye week. And I think they actually had a pretty perfectly timed bye week this year. Houston is not exactly had the kind of wins and losses you'd hope for at this point in the season. Obviously everyone would like to be 5-0, 6-0, etc. Houston's 2-4, not great. But I do think that at this point in the season, a bye week coming off of that TCU win is important. For a couple reasons. One is the true half point of the season. You play 12 games. You played 6 games so far, and you kind of at this point of the season can take a second with the bye week to pause and look at your team and the reflection of yourself openly and honestly, right? You both know what you've got in the sense that you understand defensively you've got a strong team. You can look at what does the defense do well, what can you build on, how can we continue to get Keith Cooper on one-on-ones, how can we continue to get AJ Halsey in the area of the field that the other team's trying to exploit, right? How can we continue to get Michael Batten on the pass rush and blitzes and dogs and so on, right? We understand things that we do well. You also know what you don't do well. Houston has struggled, it's no secret, to score points, right? And so you've got half of a season of film to look at and half of a season of film to build on. The film weighs heavier when it's yourself, and you've got 6 games to look at. But you also, inversely, have 6 games to fix it. So it's not like it's so late in the season that you can't do anything about it, right? And so you can really kind of take a lot of data, information from that first half of the season, digest it, synthesize it, do something with it, and figure out which one to do the second half of the year. From a health perspective, you know where your dings are. We know Joseph Manjack has been dinged up. Zeon Chriss took a lump in the first game of the year at UNLV, right? You kind of know what you guys have. I still think Parker Jenkins is dealing with something from Oklahoma. That's not reporting. That's just watching the way he runs. Take a week to kind of get healthier, but it's not so early in the year that you can't take advantage of the time off. And it's not so late in the year that those things have exacerbated, right? It's kind of that middle point. You can really take care of your guys' bodies and so on. Really important for a team and frankly, a first-year head coach at the University of Houston, Willie Fritz, and his staff to do all of those things, right? A lot of this was theoretical in the spring, right? Game weeks will look like this, right? This will be how that goes, etc. Because while you were building that culture, that program, etc., we pulled in some transfers from Tulane. You didn't have a whole lot of guys that had lived it with this staff. Now you do, right? You have all that stuff to work on in the midpoint of the season. You got extra days to do it, etc. You also, for Houston at this point, know who your quarterback is. Willie Fritz said it in Monday's press conference. It's no secret Houston's rolling with Zeon Chriss from here on out. The Louisiana transfer took the job by the reins. I shouldn't say stole the job. He took the job by the reins and did not give it back in that TCU football game. And frankly, while Donovan stepping at the end to kind of seal the deal, twist the dagger or whatever was great, and I think he should be commended for that. This is Zeon Chriss' job now, and you also know with a bye week, okay, we've talked about on the show before, there are things Zeon does well that require a different offense than Donovan. They require a different offense than Clayton Tune. They require a different offense than OLA, right? Now you've got an extra days. Frankly, last week you had days without a game week opponent to just focus on what in our playbook do we need to make sure we can hang our hat on that is a Zeon Chriss kind of playbook. How can we steer this to make sure if he's the guy, we're not splitting time anymore, we're going to Zeon. How can we steer this offense in a way that builds it around him? You had a whole week to do that extra, right? And in August, you kind of thought you had a starting quarterback. We heard coaches say as much, and it kind of, in hindsight, sounds a lot like coach speak, right? That they all wanted to come coach Donovan here. And I will say a Big 12 team with a returning quarterback, I think, is part of the enticing part of the job. But you thought you had a quarterback back then. That has changed. And without going down a bunch of rabbit holes and roads about what changed that, Donovan wasn't as good this year as it was last year. He lost a job, right? And so now with the Zeon, you've got to figure out, okay, what ways can we get him on sprint outs out in space? How can we easily run the things that are set up for him to succeed more commonly, more often? How can we, pull more of what he does well out of him in this system? That's all on Barbay and staff to do. And I know people have mixed opinions on Barbay already. 6 games in, folks, but people have mixed opinions on Barbay already. And I think we'll see a lot about how he's adapted his offense in the second half of the year here now that he knows who his offense is supposed to be built for. It's hard to build an offense for 3 very different quarterbacks, as it sounds like he might have been doing beforehand. Now we know that the guy is Zeon. It needs to be built around one quarterback, at least for this year. The other thing about this bye week is, bluntly, as much as I talked about Kansas this episode, Kansas is very beatable. I'm not a big gambler. I would say my money would be on Houston to win this game, definitely, this weekend, right? Houston should win this football game. The next week, you've got Utah. Well, I think at the start of the year, preseason, we all thought that was going to be a really daunting task. Now Utah is without a quarterback. Cam Rising is done. We don't know a lot about Isaac Wilson. Utah is spiraling. And then suddenly, if you were to win those 2 games, gasp, you're back to 4-4. I mean, is it even possible to think about like what happens once Houston is 4-4? You come off of that Utah game and go straight. Make sure I got this right. But after Utah, you come home to play Kansas State, one of the best teams in the conference, in early November. But then you're at Arizona. They don't look as good as we thought they were. Baylor, super winnable. Like, all of a sudden, these games are kind of adding up, folks. And I don't mean to say that Willie Fritz should get 6 wins in his first year. That's a big ask of anyone. But it certainly doesn't feel off the table. And I'm going to keep beating the drum that, like, even without having to upset Kansas State or BYU, who both look really good, there's a world where Houston wins 6 games this year. And I think that'd be huge for a number of reasons we'll talk about throughout the season. Got basketball to talk about as well. We're doing a book club every Monday, so go get Mirren's book, Dream, Life and Legacy of Hakeem Olajuwon. We're doing the first 3 chapters next Monday. We did the intro and the prologue and stuff like that, an episode yesterday. So make sure you go check those out. Get the book. Get to be, best Houston Cougar athlete of all time, Hakeem Olajuwon, right? What else could you ask for? Then you can read about a biography with the author. She'll be at Brazos Bookstore on Thursday evening, I believe. Double check her Twitter X profile to make sure I'm right on that. But she's great. The book's great. It's really good. Anyway, we'll be breaking that down. Houston Cougar basketball. More on the Kansas football game this week. We got Big 12 squad on Thursday as well, always. Lots of fun things happening here at Locked On Cougs. Locked On Cougs, primarily the Locked On Podcast Network. That means your team every day. Go Cougs.